All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to FDA Security, Cybersecurity, and Medical Devices, Quality System Considerations and Content of Pre-Market Submissions. This is a really hot topic. We have over 400 people registered for this webinar, so it's going to be great content, really valuable. We're going to have ample time for Q&A, so make sure you save those questions for the end. My name is Nicole Owens. I am the Director of Marketing Communications for MassMedic. I'd like to thank Intertech today for sponsoring this webinar. If you're not familiar with MassMedic, maybe this is your first webinar joining us. We are a medical device trade association for companies and those who work with medical device manufacturers in the state of New England. We work to bolster the ecosystem through education, through events like this, connection, awareness, and advocacy. As I mentioned, we are going to have ample time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions anytime throughout the presentation, and we will make sure those get answered. And now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our panel. Wonderful. From Intertech, we have George Strom. He's the Director of IoT, and Joe Dawson. He's the Operations Manager from EWA Canada. So without further ado, I will turn it back to George. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is obviously a very important time in the medical device arena when it comes towards the cybersecurity requirements, not only at the US level, but also the global level. So Joe and I are very happy to be here and very honored to be here with you folks for this presentation. So please, if I sound like I have a bad Boston accent, it's true, but it's not intentional, it's just who I am. So without further ado, we'll get going. I'm going to put myself so you won't see my smiling visage, but you will have better bandwidth, if you will. So today we're going to go through the requirements for the FDA requirements. And we're going to go over very quickly, we'll talk about the scope of products that are required, the general principles, using a secure product development format to manage, and also the transparency they're looking for. So if there are questions, as Nicole said, please wait to the end, and Joe and I will be as diligent as possible to answer your questions. So looking at the draft requirements and the scope requirements that the FDA is looking for, if you think about why we've gotten to this point, I think it's very important that we're all very cognizant. If you consider two interesting factoids that are out there in the marketplace today, on average, the average hospital bed has 10 to 15 different connected products per bed, which could lead to a lot of different potential issues for a connected product. And equally, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen non-traditional healthcare products being utilized in the home. And now you have a home healthcare issue where largely unsecure products could be in the same environment of a medical device, which has led to increased concerns from the FDA. And if you think about the scope is pretty direct and straightforward in the document, everything from pre-market notifications to NOVA requests, investigational device exemptions, humanitarian device exemptions, all those products are considered. So it is applicable that if your device has software, the odds are that it's probably going to be required to have cybersecurity. So we look at the general principles for cybersecurity. What I find very intriguing from the start of this document is how it aligns with the CFR, 21 CFR 820 and design principles. And you really start considering, the risk-based of your product and how to identify the security risks, the design requirements, and how those risks will be controlled for your device. I think this is a really critical time. And if you think about, say, a glucose device, glucose monitoring device, how could that be monitored in the home? What is the risk factor of that? Joe, perhaps you want to give us a little education of potential risks of a device that's used in a non-traditional environment.
Absolutely, George. So one of the things that we're seeing and what the FDA really wants us to focus on is the fact that, with something like a glucose monitor, which is something we're heavily involved in, you have devices which are often connected now to cell phones, so that you may be using such a device and it gives you, what your glucose level is. And then depending on that input, you will then make a dosage decision as to how you deal with the dosage. So the FDA considers that one potential risk. But then the other side of that risk is the same software put into a glucose pump, where some pumps actually check your glucose and then immediately do the dosage to you. That same software is considered a much higher risk, because now the actual software is prescribing medicine. So in both scenarios, the code is figuring the dosage level, but in one scenario where it's built into the pump itself may be actually doing the dosage without the interaction of a person, and that's a much considered higher risk. So that's why, even though the same software in both devices, the FDA considers those two very different risk scenarios.
Thanks, Joe. In a secure product development framework, it really is a way to identify the threats and the vulnerabilities that are in your software that potentially could lead to patient harm. Vulnerabilities exist in all software, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. And many times they're used for the functionality of the device. And it's how you go about identifying that potential risk and how you put hardening around the vulnerabilities. I think it's an important time that when people start planning for their products, it's much easier to plan for it and plug it in. And that's a phrase that I borrowed from the FDA, because it really does make sense to start designing your architecture early and making those security measures on the front end. And designing for security comes in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms. I think it's very critical that your objective is really to reduce and the severity of the vulnerabilities and reduce the exploit. Can a device be exploited? I think this is a really critical time. And in essence, you really want to understand, to Joe's example of a device that has software, could that dosage be changed, or could the device actually be altered because somebody wants to do something nefarious? We actually have tested products where, when the device was being operated, we were able to hack in through, say, the mobile application to shut down devices. This creates a tremendous concern to the end device manufacturer and how they handle that, but also what would be the potential harm to a patient if that happened, say during a surgical device or something that could create critical harm to the patient. And that's what you have to start to consider. How can my device be exploited? How can I create the risk and identify the risk so I know what may happen to my device when we are hacked? And the general principles in the transparency is what the FDA is really advocating for. How can you tell us what is the risk factor of your device? And that's where we see a lot of clients, when they go and submit to the FDA, they have questions regarding cybersecurity today. The FDA, in many instances, have told our clients, you need to make sure that you don't have risk with your cloud connection or the USB ports. And those are probably the two primary areas we're seeing our client requests come from, where clients are saying, we have this issue, we don't know what to do. But now we're saying identify it in the front end, and then how you address that is very critical. So have a process and the documentation, so you have that transparency and the documentation, so when you submit to the FDA. And I have to say that the FDA is very open to dialogue on the front end about, when you do have questions, please ask them, because they're there to help you as well. Skip the slide, I apologize. Oops. The goal is really to maintain safe and effective dates. I think having a trustworthy device and having it tied to your quality system, from a practicality perspective, makes a lot of sense. And there's a reference standard in this secure product framework that is very critical. And I'm going to have Joe just give a little detail on this IEC 62443 that Joe has really good knowledge on. He actually sits on the standard technical panel. Joe, could you give us an example of how 62443-4-1 could benefit the medical device community?
Absolutely. Well, let's just back up a little bit and say that 62443 was developed, and it's a set of standards that were developed, as we say here, for industry automation. But that standard is a very mature, rich standard, which really goes through all of the security lifecycle processes in 4-1 and really gets in the methodology of ensuring that you have a safe and effective software development lifecycle, and it breaks into great detail. So taking that standard, which is pretty well the industry leading standard in any industry for software development lifecycle from a security perspective, especially, that standard now is being used around the world. And matter of fact, in Europe, there's even some discussion of building a sort of a standard around for medical device testing that's going to be based on 62443. So that family of standards is really mature, and it really gets into the nitty gritty of what's important and does everything in the software development lifecycle from the initial development, how you ensure that you don't have vulnerabilities in your code through the development process, as well right to the end of life, and how you come to end of life, how you decide when a product should be taken out of circulation and everything. So it's really from the very earliest thoughts of when you're developing a device to the last days of taking it offline, and even includes things like removing all the data, the client data or patient data that might be stored on a device at the end of life. So it really is from the beginning to the end.
Thanks, Joe. Another key factor that I find very intriguing as well, probably one of the more intriguing, which historically you may know Intertek as an electrical product safety laboratory and EMC laboratory, is the statement or the application to have a separate ISO 14971 document, which would identify the cybersecurity risk towards the patient. This really is a framework that it dovetails into the TIR 57 document. And I think this is something that a lot of clients have asked us as well, how to do this, how would I design or populate the 14971 document so that I understand what the potential risk is to my patients on my device. And it really is the evolution of all of our connected products. So we have to look at this as an opportunity to say, does this make sense? And in my opinion, it's a solid move. The security risk management aspect of it is really, the known vulnerabilities of your software, they're out there, and how you have design mitigations for those vulnerabilities is very critical, as well as understanding, when that risk is transferred to the end of life of a product. I think that, or I feel that manufacturers need to understand that historically, has this been part of their process, particularly with startup companies? They haven't even launched a product. Why are they worried about risk transfer? So I think they're saying, let's put that on the front end, and we can have a better evolution or better ecosystem of our products. Threat modeling is something that is really understands what are the risks and the implied controls for a system and the effectiveness of that device. And I think there's a lot of public domain data out there to do threat modeling, but this is certainly something that manufacturers can start to capture the risks throughout the supply chain. It also makes it a very iterative process when they're starting to understand on the front end where they have potential risks. The third-party software bill of materials is something that is pretty straightforward. If you start thinking about, how do I understand as a manufacturer? I have my operating systems, and then we're going to integrate some device drivers such as Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, or possibly both. And then I also have some open source libraries. The onus really becomes back towards the manufacturer. They have to understand what is in their build. And it also provides them with a mechanism to identify the vulnerabilities. If they compare to, say, the NIST known vulnerabilities database, they would have something that they could point to from the moment they launch their product throughout the product. It also really dovetails, begins to start turning towards the actual testing of a product, to understand that throughout the life cycle of a product, you may have a vulnerability that today may not be a risk factor, but 6 months down the line, a year down the line, potentially could be a threat level. And how do you handle that? And that goes back to your threat modeling. It goes back to what testing you may decide to do. And it really becomes a good cornerstone for your tech file. And the documentation this is, I find, very straightforward for the manufacturer. And of course, as I outlined before, it is that Lego brick, I think, that Intertek uses pretty regularly in our presentations, but it makes a lot of sense from a visual aid if you think about how software is compiled. And when you have this and you have the critical rationales and you go through potential anomalies and potential security impacts, this will start building and make a lot of sense to the end manufacturer and when on your tech file submittal. Really, the key is when you're developing this plan is the effectiveness of the device, the outputs of the security risk, as well as when you're submitting to the FDA, your plan should describe the threat model and your TIR 57, as well as your software bill of materials and any associated documentation. As you begin, compiling all this information, it's a great way to summarize the risk evaluation methods and process that you, the manufacturer, have created. The other concept that is very pervasive in this document is the total product lifecycle security risk management. And this really allows all clients to start building out, what are the impacts that could potentially happen, what are the potential patient risks. And the FDA does recommend that there are metrics and measures that are in place, such as the percentage of identified vulnerabilities, the time for vulnerability identification, whether it's updated or patched, and the time for when your patch is available to complete the implementation. Joe, perhaps you could give an example of a client who had questions on how to go through a vulnerability process and from a security risk perspective.
Sure, absolutely. So when doing that, really, ultimately, when you build your product, you're going to build certain safety controls in place in your product. So let's say, for example, your product receives files or inputs from another device. So during that process, you will say that we're going to filter those inputs to make sure that there's no bad data accepted by the device. So you put in controls to ensure that, as one example. You may also have security controls to make sure that bad devices connected to USB ports don't cause damage to the system. So you list in your process all of the security controls that you put in place. Those security controls then should be fed into a vulnerability assessment where an independent or somebody who's not directly involved with the project then does testing of putting in bad inputs, fuzzing the USB ports, doing whatever, and confirming and validating that all of the security controls that you put in place are effective and do prevent the vulnerabilities that you're talking about, as well as perhaps just general vulnerability threats and attacks against the machine. So, it's a structured penetration and vulnerability assessment based on the security controls you have, as well as some general security testing that we would do or people should do on devices, depending on if the device has a USB port, these are the known types of vulnerabilities. If it's got an Ethernet port, these are the known types of vulnerabilities. So we do all of that, as well as you want to validate against the security controls that you said you've implemented.
Thanks, Joe. So when defining the security architecture, really is the end-to-end connections and the high-level definitions of the device and how it interacts. One of the questions we have is, what are my potential threat vectors? And of course, as Joe just outlined, USB ports in conducting fuzzing tests is one example of a threat vector, as well as Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And then from there, the manufacturer or the device manufacturer has to identify and demonstrate, what are the risks and how that risk management process are controlled throughout the architecture. And this is where I think it comes down to a lot of questions to answer internally and externally from the device manufacturer of how the context of your architecture potentially could create harm to the patient or could create harm for the your patient data. And those are probably the two critical features that we get asked. So when you start implementing your security controls, you really start then looking at the process of it dovetails back into the 21 CFR. So now we've gone a complete circle back to this design principle controls, looking at your authentication, your authorization, event detection, logging. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is really where you're now going through your process and saying, here's how I handle the following, dual factor authentication. Here's how I deal with cryptography. Whatever that it may be, you're starting to document everything back to the design principles of your device. Within the document, there's also the implementation of security controls. And this is where they really start to talk about the testing of the device. Testing is something that should be done throughout the life cycle of the product, which is advocated in this document. And the testing can come in many ways, shape, or forms. Many supplier requirements today require device manufacturers to conduct penetration testing. And as I stated earlier, we often have clients requesting testing done to cloud connectivity. And there we leverage best practices under OWASP. And that's really where that supplemental testing does help our clients understand where they potentially have risk and where their device potentially could be attacked from. So when you look at your architecture views and you're going through a really end-to-end process, you're describing the overall system, describing the interconnection elements, the software, the infrastructure, the cloud. You're addressing the FDA recommendations of the potential harm to the patient. So this really becomes a risk-based approach, which then would dovetail into your ISO 14971 document. You're also defining an end-to-end process of your software, your updates, and your patches. And now you have a use case view on what should happen when the worst case scenario, if you would. This is something that is very straightforward from the FDA perspective. Now, I want everyone to be very cognizant that the comment period for this document is through July 7th. So if you do have questions, comments, or concerns, now is your time to certainly pose them to the FDA. I touched on earlier about the cybersecurity testing, and this is a really critical time in the medical device arena. If you have the capability to do the testing in-house, there's nothing saying that you cannot do the testing in-house. If you look at the leverage of third-party test reports, some of your suppliers may already have third-party test reports. But the threat mitigation that you do is really based on potential threat vectors that you may have, in my opinion. And if you consider if a vulnerability can be exploited, how do you know it can be exploited? How do you do the mitigation on it? What testing was performed? Can you provide objective evidence of that test, that testing done? And what did that assessment detail? If your service technician password is password, that's probably not a secure feature you want to advocate, but that's something that a third-party test report would vet out. And then the testing goes back to that secure principles, as Jim talked about previously. So this is something that it becomes part of the overall process. And when you make major changes to your software, it will probably lead to additional testing. If it's a minor revision, you may just want to test the gap testing between the original assessment and what's changed throughout the life cycle. From a transparency perspective, the document does outline 4 critical areas. One is labeling the product itself and giving device specifications, all the backup documentation, and of course the process. I think there's a lot more contained in. Well, I know there's a lot more reading the document, but the process is very critical, not to underplay it. So when looking at the end-to-end aspects of the process, you obviously have to have that process to go through and understand what the impact will be, where I have potential risks, how I manage those risks, what happens when I have vulnerabilities. All those become critical factors, including up to how I go about my security testing. And the vulnerability management plan is something where you have to have a plan on, what happens when I do have a vulnerability. What is the amount of time that I will potentially, or my organization will respond to or update my patching. All those documentations have to be in place upon submittal. You can't then mail in your management plan after the fact. The FDA has recommended that it comes part of the pre-market submission. So this is something that we also have a lot of questions on when manufacturers saying, well, what does it mean to have an update process? What does it mean to have patching capability? So this is a critical time. They have to have this documentation prior to, so that it is part of the overall submittal. And with that, Joe and I will open the floor to questions.
And George, there is no shortage of questions.
Awesome.
We are inundated with questions, my friend. So I'm going to try to go through some of these. I tried to answer some of them, but I think for the benefit of everyone on the call, that some of these are great questions. So we'll try to cover these as best we can.
Okay, Joe.
So one of the best they're all great. I'm not going to pick winners and losers here, but someone's asking about why isn't cybersecurity risk just another category in the risk assessment process? Why do they need another separate process? And it's a great question. Like I said, the reason for that is because some of these risks with specifically, and George, you can add to this after, but cybersecurity is they're not a fixed point in time in the sense that a system may be vulnerable to something, electrical vulnerability. If you've got wires that can take 10 amps, they're going to take 10 amps tomorrow or the next day. But these security vulnerabilities tend to be moments in time. New vulnerabilities come up, new patches need to be updated, new software vulnerabilities. So it's a moving process. And so it's much more of a living document, breathing document with updated changes. Plus, you tend to be releasing new software versions on a regular basis. So that's another reason why we tend to see that people want to keep these documents separate. And the TIR 57 process is one of the better documents out there. I think, George, you covered that already, but it really gets into that. And so we've found that having this as a separate document is both better from the FDA's perspective, it also benefits you in your ability to track and manage that. Do you have anything else you want to add to that, George?
Well, I think what is it being asked of today is a new process. Yes, absolutely correct. But it is not inherent in any of the other risk management processes that are out there today. So is it supplemental or is it additional? Additional, obviously, but I think it's becoming, we're seeing from a standard-based perspective in other industries where they're integrating process and procedures into electrical safety standards. That has not happened in the medical device arena, but we are seeing that in other verticals. And it's an interesting time where this process and the reference of new standards such as the IEC 62443, it's bringing in best practices that previously didn't exist at a global scale.
Exactly.
Hopefully we answered that question.
Yeah, and if not, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on the screen.
Yeah.
So feel free. To anyone whose question doesn't feel like we fully answered it.
We're trying to keep it high level, obviously.
Obviously.
And the more private private conversations, we obviously can get deeper into a topic with it.
And we can speak about your specific device.
100%.
Yeah. So another question someone asked is about the usage of 62443, and basically, could I do a 62443 certification and basically on my device, and then would the FDA just accept that? 62443, once you get into it, is a family of standards. 4-1 is the process lifecycle, and then you've got 4-2, and there's 3-1. There's a bunch of standards about devices and processes and a whole family of standards. So yes, when it comes to the life cycle, I'm fairly confident that if you were to do a 4-1, the life cycle, that would check the life cycle aspect of the box for the FDA. The life cycle is one factor, right? It's not everything. So be aware of that. But 62443 is the standard that for life cycle anyway, the FDA is pointing to significantly. The slides will be shared. We said that.
Yes, absolutely, they'll be shared.
And someone want to know what the typical cycle of testing, validation, perform, vulnerability assessment. We generally say the typical repeat on that is yearly at a broad scope, but then if you have versions that are released or significant changes, then that may also change your cycle. So if you change from a 1.0 product to a 2.0 product where there's vast new functionality and differences, then you may want to do that at a different level. But as a minimum, some sort of yearly refresh of testing is a rule of thumb. You know, anything you want to add on that, George?
No, I also think that you need to, as manufacturers, understand that when they're starting their process, if it's a new product to launch, they should factor in the actual process of a vulnerability assessment, and that could be with a penetration test. That could be anywhere, depending upon your provider, 4, 5, maybe 6 weeks of testing, because it's highly iterative, as we've uncovered with our clients.
Yeah. Someone also asked, if a medical device manufacturer buys off-the-shelf product for the medical devices, is it the responsibility of the device manufacturer to ensure the security of that? Yes. However, if you were to buy such said software, I would ask that you go to those companies and say, have you had any independent testing done? What evidence do they have? And hopefully they've already done some testing and evidence, and then you could provide that evidence and testing as to that. If you're just using off-the-shelf software and you have no a validation of it being secure or not, then it becomes your responsibility to ensure the security of that software. I think I'm going to skip a couple of 62443 because I think I don't want to hog the entire discussion about that. Someone asked, do we need to address cybersecurity risks that are not patient or user, such as business? Absolutely. I think that, if we talk about business, that brings in the concept, the privacy maybe aspect of it is that if you have a cloud service where you're collecting data belong to people, and then you have a business process where, let's say, you let your marketing folks access to that data, then the FDA is going to have a question with that. So they want to know the people and business process in your organization, who gets to access what data, what level of access do they have, and so on and so forth. What standards and what criteria should we use? That's a vague question. I don't know for which part, but for security, the FDA has not been too prescriptive. They just want to know that you're using a standard. They want you to say what standard and methodology that you're using, whether it be a risk assessment methodology, whether it be a vulnerability assessment methodology. Just say what you're using. And then if it's generally an industry accepted standard, they're going to be okay with it. And they're not too fussy. They just want to make sure it's not the Joe Dawson standard, the George Strom standard. They want to know it's some industry accepted standard that has been vetted by the industry and generally is accepted. And let's see. I mean, George,
here's a good one, Joe. How should this process is audited in a QMS? That's a tremendous question. And today, it's more audit trail based, say for the European Union in the MDR. It's not under the service end of say the ISO 13485. So I think that it's if you go to look at the if you're selling to the European Union and you're looking at the European Union medical device regulation, it's under Annex 1 essential requirements, and then the notified body would have to then, when they conduct their audits, they would look for it as well.
Yeah. Another great question here is, do you have any advice on helping streamline these activities for startups? Yes, we do. It's really difficult to answer in just this webinar format. We deal with a lot of startup organizations that are having these problems, and that basically we do offer vulnerability testing and certification and services. So depending on your organization, there may be some of these things which you can do in-house. There may be some things you can get organizations like us or others to assist you with. And so really it's on a case-by-case basis and understanding that. But, the point is that there are organizations out there that can assist you walk through this process. And if you want to reach out to us, we'll be happy to walk you through that process. But the answer is going to be slightly different for every organization. Every startup is different. And I don't want to give a glib answer here that's going to not necessarily meet everyone's needs.
So here's an intriguing question. How do you assure there are no exploitable vectors in a complex device that is potentially remote controlled? Obviously, a very high level question, but certainly great question. A high level, maybe a good example of how we'd go about looking at that device. Sure.
So I think that the answer to your question is can't. There's no guarantees. So let me start by saying we don't say that anyone who says our device has no vulnerabilities. Matter of fact, the FDA once said to me that I was talking to some people there, and they said, if we get a vendor who comes to us and say our device has absolutely no vulnerabilities, they said, that's a bit of a red flag, because every device has vulnerabilities. The thing is, what you do is you come up with a rational process of what you've done to minimize the potential, and you come up with a rational process of the tests that you performed to remove the risks, and that basically you're making a presentation to the FDA as these are all the things we've done to ensure that during a development process, we didn't add vulnerabilities to the system. And if they were there, these are the validation processes we use to test and to try to remove those vulnerabilities. And these are the tools and techniques we use to fix vulnerabilities when they were identified. And that's all you can do, right? It's about risk, saying that you understand the problem and that you've taken steps the best of your ability to remove and lower the risk and odds of there being a remotely controlled or remotely accessible vulnerability. And if you make a good case to the FDA as how you've taken best practices to remove those and lower that risk, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for that you considered and taken good steps and done the best you can to lower the odds that these sorts of things are happening. I think that's the best advice I can give on that.
Joe, here's a question. I'll spin into a bit broader sense, but
Okay.
From a threat modeling perspective, are there multiple methodologies out there?
There's yes.
Yeah. Thanks. Could you give a couple examples?
Yeah. I want to be careful because sometimes when I give examples, people think, "Oh, we should use that one." Microsoft has a few, and there's a few out there that they're popular. The FDA has basically accepted all of all the industry accepted methodologies out there, and that there's really none that I think of that you shouldn't use. What the FDA is really looking for is that you find one that works for your organization, and I want to be hesitant because if your organization has a process in place now, use it if you're finding it works, or go to another one. But we really like to, when we work with an organization, there's about 10 or 15 different ones that we've used, and we really work with our clients to see which one makes sense for them. So it's not a case of what's the best one out there. They're all excellent. It's just a matter of pick one and use it, and then you'll be fine. But again, we do often mention the AMA's document. George, the numbers are escaping me. The risk document, the
14971.
Yeah, that one really speaks to making sure that you're considering risks. And then that also lists a number of risk assessment methodologies you use. So I'd refer to that document as well. So post-launch, someone asked, how do we make sure that when devices are sold, installed, serviced by third parties? So this is all about, as someone asked, how do we ensure that vulnerabilities aren't put into our product, I guess, by third parties after post-launch? This really speaks to software signing, which is basically the concept that any software updates that are put out on the device are validated and signed, digitally signed, and that you have a requirement that all the software on the device is validated and signed by your system. So basically, if somebody tried to stick a USB stick with a false patch on it, it would, very first thing we do is see that this hasn't been signed by your company, digitally signed this concept, and then ensure that that software has been approved by your organization. This is a very common process we're seeing, using things like hashes, MD5 hashes, to validate that the software is correct is not considered adequate. So it really needs to be a digital signature. And for devices where there's significant risk to patient harm, we're even seeing that secure bootloaders, which ensure that from the time the moment the device is turned on to the actual booting of the device, that it's actually validating the software on the device the whole way through. Some people might think this sounds like overkill, but you have to remember that almost every smart light bulb and IoT device and every cell phone for the last 10 years has probably had secure bootloaders in them. It seems like it only seems like a lot to ask for an organization that has never been doing it. So yeah, basically, this is a case of medical devices having to, in some cases, catch up to security best practices that have been in place in industries which actually generally have lower risks than the medical device space and have been implementing them for quite a period of time. So yeah, it's a case of catch up for the medical industry, but certainly a good one. We've had over 47 questions so far, so these are great. We're probably
Fantastic
not going to be able to
questions.
get to all of them for sure.
I'm just trying to catch up on where we are, Joey.
I know, and me too, George. This is a bit of a struggle. We really love this.
There's one joke. We combine cybersecurity and a vulnerability plan.
Absolutely.
Another really good question. I think, in my opinion, they're rather intertwined. I think your vulnerability plan is very. It's something that's always been required by the FDA from a post-market perspective, but now it's intertwined with your cybersecurity and understanding that plan and the impact it has on the device, the impact it has in the organization, and having that as a living document and understanding how it dovetails into all your cybersecurity is very critical.
Yeah. More people are also having issues with the fact that the FDA wants risk as a separate document. They feel that risk analysis is always a living document. Fair point. The FDA has really reached out and said, though, that they would like to see this as separate. Again, if you have issues with these items, all the items, we should be careful, George. The presentation that we put forward is not Joe and George's view of the universe. This is the FDA's guidance.
That's right.
So if there's aspects of this FDA guidance that gives you heartburn, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You're reading it, you say, I don't like that. You still have the opportunity to make comments to the FDA. This is what the FDA is asking for. This is the approach they want to take. We've been involved with several clients who've tried to put the risk documents together with the cyber documents and found it to become cumbersome. The FDA has seen that to become cumbersome and have asked it to be separated. And to be honest with you, the clients that we have who have chosen to separate it have found benefit. If you believe that's not going to work for your organization, which could totally be the case, then you should comment to the FDA about it and what you need to do. But yeah, these are the FDA's recommendations. What about requirements for best practice for non-medical device software applications? Something like medical device data systems. Great question. The FDA is starting to deal with that. Right now, they're focusing on medical devices, but I would anticipate as once they've solved this problem, you're going to see that similar practices are going to be applied to software systems in hospitals, because there are some of these software systems in hospitals which then feed data into medical devices. So we're going to actually see that, if you're talking about a system where the medical device may, a PACS system, where images get sent to a PACS system in a hospital, and then you're going to have PACS systems feeding back to medical devices. So I think the FDA has said at some point they will start to focus on those requirements. When it comes to cybersecurity, and this is why 62443 has become so popular and other standards the IEC has, is because security is generally security. It's not specific to medical devices. So if you do a good, solid practice for cybersecurity on an industrial control system, and it's a good practice, it will apply to a medical device. And cybersecurity for a medical device is not necessarily grossly different than cybersecurity for other software systems in a hospital. So I don't think you should be applying different processes. I think you can use these processes unilaterally through the organization. We do have, someone asked about software bill of materials and monitoring solutions. There are a number of software products out there that do that. A number of organizations also provide software monitoring solutions. Yeah, I have to tell you that we also do that. We also provide a software monitoring solution for medical devices. But basically, the idea here is to ensure that your software has there are no known vulnerabilities in the third-party modules that you use, or that you have a process for dealing with those vulnerabilities on some frequency and some time base. Do a risk assessment surface, need to do threat modeling. Yes, risk assessments should include threat modeling processes. Someone asked if we can you just do one without the other? It depends on the device. If you were to do risk assessments of the surface and you were to determine that no risk impact would have patient harm because your device, the way it's used, the nature of it, then you may not need to do threat modeling. However, if your surface risk assessment was to identify risks that could potentially have patient harm, then you probably want to go to full-blown threat modeling with risk assessment.
Joe, here's a good one. How does FDA cybersecurity talk to or overlap HIPAA regulations?
It overlaps, I would say. I think that there's a difference between security and privacy, right? It's a great question.
It's a question we get a lot, Joe, right? I think that's one of the FAQs.
Yeah.
I would say that, and what supplemental testing can be done for the cloud. But you're right, the privacy element of HIPAA is not covered in the security of the FDA document today.
No, not a primary concern.
And there's one last question that just came in, Joe. Is 62443 mandatory or guidance?
It's guidance. And I also see one about UL 2900.
I didn't see that one yet.
Another one that I also sit on. So I'm going to answer both at the same time. Both of them are guidance. But if you were to follow the requirements of UL 2900 and 62443, and I'm not saying you have to get assessed or certified to both, but if you were to read both those standards and sort of see what the commonality and the types of requirements are in both those standards, and you said, you know what, we have processes in place and we could demonstrate compliance to all of those processes, and then you were to provide in your, you had independent testing done or internal testing or whatever you chose to validate that you're actually meeting those requirements in those two standards, the FDA would have, you would swimmingly go through any FDA assessment, right? Both those standards, and especially UL 2900, are high bars to reach over. Very few devices do that. And just to that case, we looked at a device a couple of years ago from a manufacturer who's been making devices for longer than I've been alive, and they asked us to assess how well they could comply to UL 2900 2-1, and our initial assessment was they had 2% compliance to the standard. And that wasn't because their device was insecure. It was because they hadn't demonstrated in their documentation and processes how they met the requirements of the standard. So it's really about making sure that your processes and documentation are well written, that you provide a good story and a good case to the FDA to show how you deal with this and how you're ensuring that your system and your devices are going to meet the requirements of that standard. But both those standards are great starting points, certainly. I don't think we can answer everything, George.
I don't know if we could.
But I hope you found this helpful. And with that, I think we'll pass it back to Mass Medical.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a very interesting and, as you can see, popular discussion. If your question was not answered and you'd like to reach out to George or Joe, obviously you can see their emails here on the screen. George.strom@intertech.com, joe.dawson@intertech.com. I encourage you to reach out to them. They're a wonderful partner. And again, I want to thank them for sponsoring this webinar. We cannot put on this amazing educational content for our members without sponsor companies like them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I do encourage you to go to massmedic.com and check out our upcoming events to stay in the loop of what's going on. You can also check out our upcoming activities on social media. You can follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. With that, have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.